turbo engine running.
Absolute genius.
Get this.
Welcome.
This is the show where we bring you
Science.
What that essentially means is
discoveries,
Advances.
Questions. Research.
technology.
Unbelievable.
Without further ado,
This is The Naked Scientists. Hello, welcome to The Naked Scientists podcast. This is the show where we bring you the biggest breakthroughs and talk to the major movers and shakers in the worlds of science, technology and medicine. With me, Chris Smith. This week, Titans of Science is back with the space archaeologist who's pioneered satellite imagery to find ancient Egyptian civilizations. She's Sarah Parcak.
From Cambridge University's Institute of Continuing Education, this is The Naked Scientists.
Sarah Parcak was born in Bangor, Maine on the 23rd of November 1978. She attended Bangor High School before reading Egyptology and archaeology at Yale University. She then studied here in Cambridge under the supervision of the world-renowned Egyptologist Barry Kemp. And you'll be pleased to hear, Sarah, actually, that Barry was one of the first guests that we interviewed here on The Naked Scientists when we first set the programme up all those years ago. So history is repeating itself and you're back here in his stead, and we remember him fondly. After that, she was a teacher at Swansea University and then also at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. She's pioneered the use of tech to advance archaeology, including the use of detailed satellite images, which has earned her the nickname the Space Archaeologist. Sarah's discovered literally thousands of forgotten settlements and tombs, including the famous Egyptian city of Tanis, which, if you're a Raiders fan, you will know was immortalised in Harrison Ford's Raiders of the Lost Ark. A very warm welcome to Titans of Science, Sarah. Great to have you with us.
Thank you so much. It's a delight to be here.
Well, what took you down the path of archaeology then?
So I've been interested in archaeology in ancient Egypt ever since I was a small child, growing up in Bangor, Maine in the 1980s. It's not like we had the internet and endless YouTube videos and certainly not cable, but we lived across the street from the Bangor Public Library, which I celebrate whenever I can. The librarians there help to find me books on ancient Egypt. I think having a grandparent who was an academic got me interested in the field generally as well. My grandfather was a forestry professor at the University of Maine in Orono. And as a result, every weekend, we lived close to them and we would go visit them often. We would spend as much time as we could outdoors. So I developed a love of being outside from a very young age and exploring. My grandparents certainly encouraged that. My parents, to this day, don't know where my interest in Egypt came from. They said one day I just started talking about it. And when I was 5 or 6 years old, whenever I lost my first tooth, the tooth fairy brought me what even now I think is a really good book on ancient Egyptian history. And that just got me started. And then I had the chance to study Egyptology and archaeology. There's a gentleman, sort of like Barry Kemp in the US. His name was William Kelly Simpson, an eminent Egyptologist who studied language and religion and culture. And I had the chance to work very closely with him. I was his research student all the years of my time at Yale. He was extraordinary. So yeah, I was very blessed to be able to work with Kelly and then Barry in graduate school.
But when did you first set foot in Egypt then? And did that crystallise, all that interest you'd had from what you'd learned at university? We all know it's a bit like driving a car. You never really learn to drive and know that it's for you or not for you until you actually get behind the wheel and hit the open road. When did you first go to Egypt and then say, this is definitely my thing?
So I had the chance to go in the summer of 1999, so almost exactly 26 years ago. It's weird saying that number. That feels like a long time, and yet it was yesterday. And so I was joining this field school that was run by Dr. Redford and his wife, Sue Redford, out of Pennsylvania State University. So I went about 2.5 weeks early, figuring, I'll just, travel around by myself. And the 46-year-old me is looking back at 20-year-old me and going, you are out of your mind. Like, what are you doing traveling around Egypt by yourself at that age? And I just went and did it. I think the world maybe was a little safer. Maybe I was just a little more naive. And when I was down in Aswan, I was on the island of Philae, and I met this lovely couple a woman from Taiwan and her husband who was German, and they were leading a tour of mostly seemed like very wealthy Taiwanese women. They said, "Oh, you're a student traveling around by yourself. You should come travel with us. We're taking a cruise down the Nile." And I said, "Look, I've counted every last penny or pound. I'm staying at roach motels. There is absolutely no way I can afford 5 days on the Nile and flying to Abu Simbel." And they said, "No, no, come meet everyone. We want everyone to meet you." And so I went over and they spoke to all these Taiwanese tourists in Chinese, and all at once they all went, "Hello, Sarah." And they later on invited me to come join them on their boat. And I went, and it was a floating 5-star hotel. And I said to them, "Look, I can't afford this. The budget for one night on here is the budget for my whole trip." And they said, "Look, there's already a younger woman who's here. We're worried because she's on her own and she's a little older than you, not much. Why don't you be her roommate and give us a couple $100 to cover basic expenses?" And so it was this like magical, otherworldly, coincidental adventure. And it felt like a door. And it felt like these winds from thousands of years ago appeared and sort of blew me through it. And I thought there's something about this country that's different, that it felt so welcoming and warm. I've actually never shared that story before publicly. And I just thought, this is the place I need to be. And asked them after, like, why did you do this incredibly generous, wonderful thing for me? The stranger that you meet, the student you meet on an island. And they said, "We just had a sense about you. We thought you would take this ahead and you would spend the rest of your life sharing your love of Egypt with everyone."
Do you think then that you might have ended up not being an Egyptologist? You could have been an archaeologist, but working somewhere else entirely if it hadn't got hold of you the way that experience did.
Egypt just always called to me. I remember being an undergraduate, and Kelly, he was such a generous human, and every fall he would invite all the first year students in the residential college where he was a fellow and I was a student to his estate in Katona, New York. Kelly had been married to one of the Rockefeller daughters. She passed away many, many years before. And then I got to go into his office, and it was 20 feet tall, old leather chairs, heavy with pipe smoke, antiquities in different places where he clearly bought them over time. And I just thought, I'm done. This is it. This is the life I want. There's something about this that speaks to a part of me, and it feels like I've been waiting my whole life to get here. You never know, right? When you go into the field, sometimes people start digging and they hate it because it's rough, it's hot, you get sick, you're far away from home. But I just always felt at home in Egypt, and the people there are so wonderful and warm and gentle. So it's another home for me, and felt that way from the first time I went.
What's it actually like when you're on a dig in Egypt? It's a pretty harsh environment, isn't it, there? I mean, it's not only ridiculously hot, but it's like being sandblasted with sand. It's getting into every nook and cranny of your body, and you're sweating. It must be pretty horrible. You must have to dig deep, excuse the pun, in order to put up with that day after day. You must really love the subject, even in order to tolerate that.
Yes, it's hot. Yes, there are flies. Yes, there's sand blowing around. But there's something about the pace of a dig, and you never know what's going to pop up. You may find a beautiful little bead or part of an inscribed fragment. I've had days or weeks where nothing has appeared, but you're so busy recording all the information, it's fine. And I try at least once an hour to pop my head up from wherever I'm working, just to look around and just kind of pinch myself. There's still that 5 or 6 year old little girl inside you who got that book from the Tooth Fairy. And this is your dream and you're living it. And you just need to feel grateful and take that gratitude and pour it into the work you're doing.
So how did the space element to this come about then? So you love doing the on the ground stuff, getting your trowel into the ground. I thought you were going to say, I didn't love it so much, and that's why I went after the cool air conditioned environment of computers, and that's how it happened, but clearly not. So why did you end up looking at satellite pictures?
So, getting back to my grandfather, he was famous in the field of forestry because he was one of the pioneers of using aerial photography and aerial photogrammetry for forest mapping and species identification. He's the reason I took my first remote sensing course as an undergraduate. And I thought, well, gosh, Grampy, he passed away a couple years before. I thought, Grampy did this. I wonder if anyone has really done this for Egypt or archaeology. Maybe I'll take this course and see. And at the time, not many people had applied it to the field of Egyptology. So I took that with me into grad school and started developing tools and techniques for archaeological site identification. And for me, that the best part was I could go and survey and map the sites that I'd found as part of these excavations. So I was able to do that in the East Delta with my then boyfriend, then fiance, and obviously now husband. We'd excavate all week and then I'd go off and do survey work on the weekends. And the same at Amarna. I could help with excavations, but also go and do survey work on the West Banks.
So talk us through then how this actually works. What images do you get from space, and how do you then use that to find stuff that we didn't know was there already?
There's two different kinds of satellite imagery that we use in the field of remote sensing. We're either using what's called passive or active satellite data. And so what do I mean by that? By passive satellites, it's data like Google Earth. A passive satellite is like a camera. It's circling the Earth, it's taking pictures of what's below, and it's recording information in different parts of the light spectrum, information in the near, middle, far infrared, in the visual part of the light spectrum, in some instances, microwave, we'll get there in a second. And then you can take that information and it comes in layers. Each slice, it's almost like you're having a big sandwich. You got your lettuce, your meat, your bread, and each slice of that sandwich represents a different part of the light spectrum. And there are things on the planet that show up really well or don't show up really well in different parts of the light spectrum. So visual features, houses, buildings, roads show up really well in the visual part of the light spectrum. Things like vegetation show up the best in the near infrared because of the chlorophyll content. And what we do as we process the data is we make these features that change because of, whether it's a ditch and the vegetation on top is much healthier because of the moisture content and the extra nutrients in the soil, or maybe it's less healthy because there's a stone wall underneath. We process that data and get those features to pop out. Now, on the other side, there's active satellite imagery or active remotely sensed data. How that's different is the sensor is actually sending down energy or pulse beams of light. So whether that's radar imagery, where we can get broad swaths of a desert and we can actually see under the sands, and we can look at old river courses, for example, or in instances where there's a sensor system on an airplane and it's flying over, say, a dense forest or rainforest in Guatemala. We can't see through that with passive satellite data. But what happens with the LiDAR sensor, which stands for light detection and ranging, it's shooting down hundreds of thousands of pulse beams of light. Thousands of them will hit the top of the canopy, thousands will hit the middle, thousands will hit the bottom, and then many, many thousands of those laser beams are going to hit the floor of the rainforest. And you can actually remove the overlaying vegetation and you're left with what's known as a bare earth model or a digital elevation model. And that's what people in my field have done to reveal tens of thousands of previously unknown features and sites.
So what was your first wow moment then? When you thought, right, I'm going to do this for Egypt, because it doesn't look like many people, if anyone had. You do this, what happened next?
I think what really hooked me was during my PhD, I did a big survey project for the first half of my thesis in the East Delta around the site where my husband Greg had been working, a site called Tabilla, dated to around 2,600 years ago. And using mostly NASA data sets, I looked at the actual chemical signature of archaeological sites. I thought, as part of my thesis, we've got all this known archaeological site data in the Eastern Egyptian Delta. And I thought, well, I've got all the known site data. What if I inputted all this into the satellite imagery, looked at the tools, methods, and techniques to first go from the known and then to the unknown, which is what we do in archaeology anyway. And doing that, processing that imagery, I had maybe 60 to 70 features pop up in the imagery that were in no known databases. And that's really what kicked me off visiting those sites.
So you were actually finding stuff. You were going to places. You began to get stuff. So you must have thought, wow, this is really cool. I'm finding new things that people haven't ever sort of thought were there before. That must have been pretty exhilarating.
It was super exciting. And not everything was a win. Sometimes I'd go to a site and it would be, I don't know, a huge pile of dirt. Or, yes, there was a site, but it was covered by a modern cemetery. So I could pick up a little pottery, but there wasn't much there. So for me, the iterative process of science also was very exciting, really being critical of what worked and what didn't work. And I would then go back and refine and try new approaches, new tools to figure out, okay, what's the real approach here? Why doesn't this work? For me, yes, it was really exciting going and mapping all these new sites and places and collecting pottery and then doing big settlement pattern studies. But I'm a dorky nerd. The process was and still is fascinating to me, right? Figuring out how you can put all these tools together at different levels of resolution, both spatial and spectral, figuring out what does each type of data allow us to see or not see.
How did Raiders of the Lost Ark and Tanis come into this then?
So, like every child of the 80s, every Friday night, my parents would get a movie for my brother and I, and pizza. It was a big deal in those days. And we'd rotate through. It was either The Princess Bride, The Dark Crystal, Never-Ending Story, or Raiders of the Lost Ark. I love that movie. It's still one of my favorite movies. Yes, I know he's problematic, but also he is a movie character. There's a lot more problematic academics in the real world I think we should be worried about. Anyway, I heard about Tanis, and then of course I studied it as an undergrad and then in grad school. And
so it was one of those places known about, as in it was documented, but not known where.
Right. So we knew, Tanis has been worked on as a site for well over 100 years. What's interesting about Tanis is there was an amazing discovery made just prior to the outbreak of World War II. So at Tanis, it was Egypt's capital in dynasties 21 and 22, so about 3,000 years ago. And all these kings who ruled from Tanis were buried in and around this very large temple complex that's in the north part of the site. And when they were excavated, they uncovered beautiful tombs that were full of gorgeous jewelry and silver sarcophagi and coffins. So these pharaohs are known as the silver pharaohs because unlike later sarcophagi and coffins, which you see made of gold, they're made of silver. And because of the outbreak of World War II, it's just not a discovery that is as well known as Tut. But if you go to the Cairo Museum today, they have a whole room filled with the finery from Tanis. So the temples have been excavated for a long time by the French team, and we knew roughly where the settlement was, but no extensive work had ever been done on it. So I was drawn there. We got very high resolution satellite imagery of the settlement of Tanis, processed it. We were able to see the outlines of almost the entire settlement and different phases of its construction. You can see barracks, you can see streets, you can see houses. It has a very similar layout in many ways to Amarna, and even a place where there could be potential palaces. So I collaborated with a French Egyptologist named Philippe Rousseau. He excavated one of the houses again as a ground test, and it was a pretty close match to what we'd seen from the imagery. So yeah, I was definitely drawn there by Indiana Jones, but did not expect that we would find, this whole outline of the settlement. That was really exciting, and I hope a genuine contribution to the field of Egyptology.
A lot of this is now desert, isn't it? So how would it have been different back in the day? And was it desertification that did for those civilizations, or did these settlements just get abandoned and then the desert encroached later? Do we know?
Sites were abandoned for lots of different reasons. In some instances, the climate would change, but I think so many sites in Egypt were abandoned at least for a time because of the Nile River. The Nile, it's hard to get a sense of this today because of the Aswan High Dam. It doesn't shift like it did in antiquity, but it did. It was every bit like the Mississippi. It would have meandered and had oxbows. If a city was located next to the Nile, it would have thrived, right? It's the epicenter of trade, information. Goods are coming into the city, goods are going out from the city, and then the Nile shifts, and that's it, right? There's no port. The city can't function particularly well. And so maybe over time it gets abandoned. I think in Egypt, we definitely see periods where climate change has a pretty serious impact on settlements. One of the periods of time that I've studied and written about, sort of starting with my PhD, is around 2200 BC, so the end of the Old Kingdom. And what happens around this time is something called the 4.2K BP event, or the 4,200 years old event. And it is suggested that potentially because of a series of solar flares or solar radiation, the weather around the world was pretty seriously impacted, sort of like a mass El Nino effect. And what happened is that the monsoon rainfall that would have filled up the Blue and White Nile basins and caused the Nile to flood every year, the rains just didn't arrive at the same levels that they did before. And so what you see starting around the end of the Old Kingdom are a series of droughts.
Are
What
these the biblical
happened?
droughts? Is this what Joseph and his family, when they had 7 lean years, is this what he foresaw?
Maybe. I mean, it's debated. But this has happened before that, before his time. So because every year the Egyptians relied so heavily on the floods, and they had to be, it had to be like Goldilocks. It couldn't be too much, it couldn't be too little. It had to be just right, and that's the role the king served. The king preserved Ma'at, this sense of balance. His job was to ensure that the Nile flooded every year, and that's why offerings were made at temples. Anyway, you had a series of disastrously low Nile floods. There were no crops or greatly reduced crops. People started abandoning these villages and moving into cities, which is something I saw as part of my PhD thesis. Pyramid construction stops, foreign expeditions stop. We see this degradation of art and great social strife going on. And this changes when the monsoons pick up again and there's regular flooding. And we see this in the New Kingdom, which is about 1800 or 2000 BC, so a couple hundred years later. But Egypt goes through this great period of upheaval, which is interesting now because the world's it's very similar to what's happening today. So to your question, these are the things we study. We look at why sites were abandoned in certain periods of time and for what reasons. And it wasn't all climate change. There's social, political, and economic reasons too. But most sites in Egypt, I think, were fairly continuously occupied, going back thousands of years. Even today, most well-known sites have people living on them or next to them.
There was a terrific program the BBC made, a series they made a number of years ago called What Did the Victorians Do for Us?, where they looked at all of the incredible engineering. But it occurred to me as I was watching that a lot of that we inherited from our forebears thousands of years ago. So I suppose I put to you the question, what did the Egyptians do for us? As well as giving us this rich archaeological legacy, what things still exist today, or techniques or doors were opened by the kind of science and maths and knowledge that these people had?
Someone I've spent a lot of time studying, Cleopatra. To this day, she has an extraordinary influence on our world, on how we imagine the past and interpret the past and think about the role of women. I think they, maybe my colleagues who work in other cultures and other places would disagree with me. I think they gave us our bureaucracy. They really figured out layers and layers of organization and management. So if any of you have problems with your line managers and are having issues with bureaucracy and getting permits or permissions or a license for something, I think you can blame the ancient Egyptians. They developed it there, and without that bureaucracy, the pyramids wouldn't have been built. What made the pyramids what they were and still are to this day was this whole system of management, of quarrying, of trade, of delivery, of workers' health, food, managing estates in the Delta to produce enough beef to keep the workers fed. So yeah, for me, I think it's bureaucracy. That's the real legacy of ancient Egypt in our world today.
And it sounds like you've embraced a lot of their techniques. And a little bird told me you're a very good baker. Is that true?
Yeah, I love baking. This is something that actually started in Cambridge. I was a grad student. I was very lucky to have funding, but it wasn't a lot of money. And so I had to learn how to cook. and how to bake. And one of the lovely things about being at Cambridge then, I hope this tradition still continues. All of us were sort of in the same boat, not a lot of money, sort of just getting by. And we would gather for a night or two a week, and everyone would bring a dish to share. And of course, you had people from all over the world, and you never knew what anyone would bring. And it sort of all worked out. There were always a couple starters, a couple mains, and some desserts. And so I really just got into cooking and baking when I was there. And bless Barry, I wouldn't be where I am without him. But I think every single person who's ever been to Amarna would tell you the same thing. And that is that he was not concerned with food in the way that we are concerned with food. There was an eminent, the grandfather of Egyptian archaeology is a guy named William Matthew Flinders Petrie. And at the end of every season, so he worked in Egypt from the sort of the 1880s onwards. He would bury all the cans that were left over. And when he started his next season, he would dig the cans up and throw them against the wall. And the ones that didn't explode, he would eat. Barry kind of carried on in that tradition. And I could always rely on our dig seasons at Amarna to keep me trim and fit for the rest of the year. And so obviously the archaeology was wonderful and he cared about us a great deal. It just, food was not a priority for him. And so I sort of promised myself that if I ever ran my own projects, I would be sure to make sure that my team was well fed. But yeah, I love baking and sharing treats with our neighbors. And, it's interesting too, because I think a lot about in the work I do in the field, how did people feed themselves? How did they survive in all these places? So it's just something else to connect the work I do to how I live today and what life was like a long time ago.
Because people have recreated some of the ancient recipes that famous bureaucracy you reference led to being documented. And there was food, there was drink, and people have tried to reinvent some of these recipes, and apparently some of them are all right. Have you not gone down that path?
I haven't personally experimented with more ancient baking. Certainly Dr. Mark Lehner at Giza has done really amazing work partnering with bakers and brewers and trying to recreate ancient Egyptian beer, because of course that's most of what the workers would have consumed alongside bread. And the bread would have been very, very dense and calorie rich, and they would have, of course, needed those for their work. I remember one program I did for the BBC, actually when our son was, well, I think I was about 3.5, 4 months pregnant with him, filming a documentary on the Roman Empire. And we were very lucky. We were working at a site in Tunisia, and the BBC had flown in this delightful woman whose name I cannot remember right now. I wish I could. And her expertise was baking and cooking in the Roman world. And she brought all of these gorgeous reproduction Roman bowls into the field. She'd gone to a market in a village and gotten all this food, which was the same as the food that had been consumed 2,000 years before. She brought garum, which is the fish sauce that the Romans used. There are many different kinds of garum, and she had cooked these goat cutlets in garum. I'll never forget. I'd been a vegetarian for years, and the smell of these cutlets cooking on an open fire in this garum, I was at the point of my pregnancy where I was getting really hungry. And the team knew that I hadn't eaten meat, but a voice in my head said, "You will eat all this meat right now." And I think they had to cut it from the show because I was like a barbarian. Like I looked at the guys who were all very excited about the meat. I said, "I'm sorry, I'm eating all of this food." Like I was gnawing at it. There were juices running down my face. It was, to this day, that will be the best thing I've ever eaten in my life. So if she's listening right now, I apologize for not being able to remember your name. You're amazing. I've never thanked you properly. And since then, I've eaten meat. So yeah, I love the people who do that work are extraordinary. I have such enormous respect for them.
Well, that's certainly food for thought, and a wonderful thought to end on. Sarah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for telling us all about why you're a titan of science and space science archaeology specifically.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been wonderful.
What a brilliant story from a brilliant scientist. That was space Egyptologist Sarah Parcak there. Well, that's it for this week. Next time, we're going to return to the world of fungi when we're asking, are we ready for the rise of fungal diseases and antifungal resistance? You will be surprised about how serious this threat is becoming. I was, and I'm a medical microbiologist. The Naked Scientist comes to you from the University of Cambridge's Institute of Continuing Education. It is supported by Rolls-Royce. I'm Chris Smith, and from all of us here at the Naked Scientist team, thanks for listening, and until next time, goodbye.